of Christianism and U.S. involvement in Afghanistan. My name is Steve Clements, and I teach political science here at the university. I also help direct the Pitt Center events, and I serve as Dean of the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. Now, today's talk obviously originated late last summer as the U.S. worked desperately and under the glare of cameras over several weeks to extract our remaining troops. Other Americans, as well as thousands of Afghan people who had assisted us in our 2-decade-long military mission in Afghanistan. That withdrawal was both a tragedy and a political nightmare for the fledgling Biden administration. Some of us in this room are old enough to have remembered 9/11 well and to have watched our military action in Afghanistan unfold in the weeks following the attacks on New York and Washington, D.C. We saw early success in terms of displacing the Taliban regime and eliminating al-Qaeda training camps there. But what to do about Afghanistan long-term then morphed into a major policy challenge that stretched across several presidential administrations. I realized across the range of students, of conversations with many of our students, that a lot of them were unaware of our long-term entanglement in Afghanistan. And so I sought an opportunity to have someone explore this topic in a way that would be thoughtful and also nonpartisan and non-polarizing. That's actually difficult to do these days. Around that time, I had a conversation with Marc LiVecche, president of the Institute on Religion and Democracy in Washington, D.C., about a collaboration between IRD and Asbury University on occasional speakers to campus, and we ultimately landed on today's speaker and this particular event with Dr. Marc LiVecche. So Marc LiVecche is actually here with us this afternoon, and so I'm going to invite him to come say a couple of things about IRD and to introduce Dr. LiVecche. They've known each other and been working together for several years. So.
Thank you very much, Steve, and it's great to be here with you all Asburyans and privileged to share this program with you. As mentioned, I'm president of the Institute on Religion and Democracy in Washington, D.C., which examines this political and social witness of Christianity in America ecumenically. And 6 years ago, we started a new magazine called Providence, a journal of Christianity and American foreign policy, specifically to examine how we should look at, or how we might look at global statecraft and national security through the lens of Christianity, not just making it up as we go along, but using the tools that are made available to us by the church's history, that it's not up to the current generation to think through what God's purposes for government is, but rather Christians have been thinking through these issues for 2,000 years. And so the great traditions, Catholic and Protestant, Anglican, Lutheran, Reformed, even Wesleyan, and others in this increasingly post-denominational age here in America. So many of us have lost memory of what those great traditions have to teach to us, including what they have to say about political theology, which is how we examine God's purposes for government. So our new program is sending scholars who are expert on political theology to speak at a select list of Christian campuses around the country, including Asbury, which as a Methodist has always been important to me, university and the seminary. And so hopefully this will be the start of an ongoing initiative with speakers perhaps a couple of times a semester. And we hope that in conjunction with these speakers, there will be an ongoing student group devoted to conversation about political theology. And we hope that we can support that student group and invite you to events in Washington, including an event next week, Thursday and Friday in DC, which maybe a couple of you are going to attend. I know Dr. Clements is, called Christianity and National Security, a day and a half of conversations with scholars talking about political theology as it relates to international relations. We still have a few slots open. We can provide a hotel and food if you can get yourself to Washington for 2 days. But I'm pleased to introduce my colleague to you, Marc LiVecche, who is the founding editor of Providence and is one of the most distinguished and rising scholars on issues related to just war especially, but also Christian realism, which he is going to explain to you. So Marc.
Thank you, Steve, for having us all here, both of us here. Need to plug in.
I'm going to start this to keep me honest. So just to give you a game plan, Christian realism in Afghanistan, that's what we're going to cover. But I don't want to talk about Afghanistan without first sort of positioning it morally within sort of the Christian realist universe. And why do I want to do that? I think the greatest tragedy of what's transpired in our withdrawal from Afghanistan has been the sort of disequilibrating effect, the jostling effect that it has had on our servicemen and women who have bled and died and been broken and seen friends bleed and die and be broken for a war that for 20 years we told them was worth fighting. And then given the manner of our withdrawal, they could be forgiven for thinking, was it? And now they don't know what to do. And many of the sailors, Marines that I talked to at the Naval Academy, my West Point friends, they're unsure of what to think about their service over the last 2 decades. And a part of why that matters is something I'll get into a little bit more in detail in a bit. But there's new understandings of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, or types of combat trauma. And one of them is something called moral injury. And a moral injury comes when you do or allow to be done something or witness something that goes against a deeply held moral commitment. And on the one hand, as I'll say in a moment, many of our war fighters have large questions about the very business of war fighting to begin with. But when they think that they have fought and bled and died, and more importantly, killed for something that they now don't know if it was right or worth it, it causes all sorts of potential moral traumas. And a part of the reason this is a problem is that moral injury is one of the leading causes of combat veteran suicide. And that's not to say that I think we can draw a straight line from the withdrawal of Afghanistan to combat veteran suicide, but we're already seeing an uptick in warfighter suicide since the abandonment of Afghanistan. It registers as a betrayal, not just of Afghan friends, interpreters and Afghan fighters who have fought alongside our troops, but it registers with our troops as a betrayal of their mission and their sacrifices. And so what I want to do is to position any conflict within a tradition of Christian realism and just war thinking. And then from there, with sort of a moral compass in place, to then touch on Afghanistan. We might not get as much on Afghanistan as you want from the lecture. We'll have lots of time for questions, all right? But I'm going to try to chum the water sufficiently to generate some responses. Sound all right? I want to begin in Afghanistan in September of 2010, when by his own admission, then Marine Lieutenant Timothy Kudo abetted in the killing of 2 unarmed Afghan kids. That was an accident. His Marine unit was patrolling in a village. They took fire. They converged on a house from where they think the fire came. One group went in to sweep the building. Another group surrounded it to secure a defensive perimeter. The group on the outside noticed a motorcycle begin to approach them from a position on a hill above them. So if these are hostiles, because they're on a hill above them, they are in a position of tactical advantage. This motorcycle can't be allowed to get closer. The motorcycle begins to get closer, and they go through a prearranged protocol to try to get it to stop. They wave it off, they shout warnings, they fire smoke grenades, they fire warning shots as the motorcycle gets closer. Finally, it seems to pause, and when it pauses, they register that they think they can see rifles. And then all of a sudden, the motorcycle gasses it. It starts to approach them faster. It passes a trigger point. At this moment, they think they see muzzle flashes, so they think they're under attack. The Marines open fire. They kill both riders. They approach. They realize that they're children. One's no older than 12. What they mistook for rifles were really shepherd's crooks. And they realized that what they mistook for muzzle flashes was probably the sun reflecting off the motorcycle's chrome. All right, so 2 unarmed Afghan teenagers died. Timothy Kudo, after he redeploys home, says, I think about those deaths constantly. He says, when I was able to remove my men from that situation, we went back into the wire. Once we were secure, I did the only thing I could do. I grieved. I think we can accept that grief in this scenario is appropriate, right? I also want to stress, as the talk continues, that grief should be a prevailing response to any kind of conflict, justified, unjustified, whatever it is. Conflict should be a source of grief to morally sensitive human beings, all right? I want to stress that grief does not necessarily mean guilt. Timothy Kudo's not so sure. It's not just the deaths of the unarmed Afghan teenagers that bothers him. He thinks about all the killing with which he was involved. And he says that prior to deployment, while his ability to kill was increasingly refined, he learned to kill from anything from a rifle shot to, artillery strike to beating someone to death with a rock. He said his thinking about the morality of killing was never refined, all right? When they deployed, they just got right into the killing without thinking twice. And to this day, he is unsure, he says, whether or not what he did was morally appropriate. He's convinced that killing is always wrong, period. But in war, it is necessary. So there's this tension, even contradiction in how he thinks about it. He puts it this way. He says, growing willing to kill another human being is a diminution of what it means to be a human being. It's a perversion accomplished only via a staggering conversion. To properly wage war, he insists, you have to be willing to recalibrate your moral compass. And if you get nothing else out of this talk today, I want to disabuse you of that belief, that in order to kill, you have to recalibrate your moral compass. Although I suppose I don't know where your moral compass currently is, but one doesn't have to recalibrate their moral compass in the manner that Kudo thinks. They have to align yourself with doing something that is morally wrong. All right, if you look for this phrase, killing is wrong, but in war it is necessary, and you read any number of combat memoirs, if you look for it, you will see some version of this phrase. It's there. It's just this tacit belief that probably predominantly Westerners or Americans have. Killing is wrong, but in war it is necessary. Vietnam veteran Carl Merlantis puts it this way. He says, the violence of combat assaults psyches, confuses ethics, and tests souls. This is not only a result of the violence suffered, it's also a result of the violence inflicted, and even more so, arguably. And I think you'll find similar conclusions drawn from within the Christian theological tradition, which some thinkers think that sometimes one must do something morally evil in order to bring out morally good objectives. All right, how do we talk about all of this? I'm going to position ourselves in Christian realism, as I've suggested, which I think gives us a better way of understanding the seeming moral contradiction. I want to tell another anecdote. I was at a chaplain's training workshop for US Army Europe, and I had given a 3-hour talk on just war, and right afterwards there was a plenary session on combat wounds, on moral trauma. And the chaplain, who has extensive combat experience, talked about the types of things that combat veterans need to recover from the difficult business that they've been doing. And he said they need things like spiritual recovery, forgiveness. They need the ability to grieve. They need counsel, all of this. No dispute with any of that. All of that is appropriate. There's one thing he never listed. He never suggested that combat veterans might actually need vindication. And this is important. You forgive someone who has done something wrong and repented. You vindicate somebody who has been found innocent of the suspicion of wrongdoing in the first place. Does the Christian intellectual tradition, I want to know, have any way of offering vindication to somebody like Timothy Kudo? And under what terms would he warrant vindication? A little bit of biography to position my own interest in this question. I became a Christian through a study of the Holocaust, which is often sort of the reverse trajectory, right? I encounter incredible evil, I become a Christian. I know that the opposite oftentimes occurs. But I wanted to know why I hated Auschwitz. I wanted confirmation that my hatred of Auschwitz had actually something to say about Auschwitz and not just my disposition, right? I wanted it to be objectively true that Auschwitz was evil. I was at the 50th anniversary of the commemoration of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau. And at the end of the formal ceremonies, they began reading the names of all of the dead. And we don't have all the names of all of the dead, but if we did, there's an estimated 1.2 million souls that were consumed in that one camp. And if it took a second to read every single name, that recitation of lost souls would have taken 13.8 days, right? An endless litany of names for 13.8 days. And I was a young Christian at the 50th anniversary of the commemoration of the liberation of Auschwitz. And most of my friends were telling me that Christians were supposed to be pacifists. And I didn't understand how, in the face of 13.8 days of names, I could be a pacifist. So the Holocaust sort of inoculated me against pacifism. And I further, after encountering folks like Timothy Kudo, couldn't understand how stopping a 14th day or a 15th day of names could be morally wrong, but still somehow necessary. That didn't make sense. So are there better ways of thinking about all of this? I think Christian realism offers one. If we had much more time, I would give you 5 points of Christian realism. They would be creation, fall, restoration, responsibility, church, and future hope. I think these are 5 general categories that maybe I can touch on that describe sort of the basic tenets of Christian realism. I'm going to touch on 2 predominantly, fall and restoration, but I want to position us briefly in creation. So Genesis 1:26, then God says, let us make man in our image, after our own likeness, and let him have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over the lions and the tigers and the bears. Oh, thank you. Okay, there's a couple of us old enough to remember. Thank you. Dominion over all the earth. All right, what is dominion? Well, it's not domination, right? Dominion is providential care. This is why we named our magazine what we named it, providential care. It's found in what it means to be made in the image of God is found in this mandate to exercise dominion, protective care, nurturing care, or stewardship. We have a responsibility, not an ultimate responsibility, but we have a responsibility in history for the conditions of history. We're not so eschatologically minded that we're no earthly good, right? And this becomes important as we talk about the rest of the subject, this idea of responsibility. So let's leap to the second framework. And incidentally, if you want to find out more about what it means to be made in the image of God, look at the Sermon on the Mount, right? It ends with this idea that the peacemakers are blessed because they will be called sons of God. And Hebraic thought that's saying something. To be a son of something means you bear the image of the thing signified. So peacemakers bear the image of God, right? And if you want to know what a peacemaker is, then you go through the rest of the Beatitudes, beginning with the meek, which is power under restraint. It's not weakness. And you begin to get a character description of what being a peacemaker looks like. And it's often very different from what we sometimes think. It's more in line with the Colt 45, right? Which was also called a peacemaker. The fall. All right, a preliminary task of Christian ethics is to get as accurate a description of the facts on the ground as you can. If you get your description of reality wrong, your ethics are going to follow. It's important to remember that human beings and any human activity is a marbling of good and evil things, right? We're a hodgepodge, right? Both almost always go together. And history attests to this. The capacity for human evil is nearly limitless, right? We have consumed our neighbors time out of memory. Now, Reinhold Niebuhr, I'm going to talk about 2 main people, Reinhold Niebuhr and Augustine. Reinhold Niebuhr is sometimes considered the father of modern Christian realism, which is fine. I have some quibbles and I'm going to get into them in a moment. Now, Reinhold Niebuhr knows about this marbling of good and evil in the human soul. He thinks it's important to linger over a caution. We must avoid either of a set of cousin errors. We can't be so sentimental that we downplay the reality of human evil, but we also can't be so cynical that we downplay human goodness. They're both there. They could both be fostered. It just depends on what we value. Now, Niebuhr, when he looks at these 2 things, says there are 2 laws that are incumbent upon human beings. The first is the law of love. The second is the law of responsibility. Human beings have to be both. The problem is that they conflict because the law of love, following the witness of Christ in Niebuhr's mind, means non-resistance to evil. It's not non-violence, it's non-resistance to evil. And if you know anything about Niebuhr, this begins to sound strange, because in the build-up to World War II, it was Niebuhr almost alone who pressured the mainline churches to abandon their non-interventionist strategy toward US involvement in World War II. He pressed for it. He had been a pacifist. He saw the buildup. He abandoned his pacifism. He argued for US, a full force US involvement in the Second World War. But he never abandoned his idea that the primary law for Christians is love, and that the primary condition of love is non-resistance to evil. All right. But he said, that won't work in this world. We also have this competing responsibility, or competing law to be responsible, right, for the conditions of history, to rescue the innocent, to requite injustices, to punish the guilty. If you only pursue love, you're not going to get it, because the world isn't amenable to love. And if you only pursue love, you're not being responsible either. You're irrelevant to the conditions of history. If you pursue responsibility, you're going to get responsibility, at least a degree of it, and you can qualify it with love. So you can get a little bit of both thrown in if you pursue responsibility. All right. There are some problems with the way he goes about this. He says this: we must strive for justice, even if it is forced to use means such as self-assertion, resistance, coercion, and perhaps resentment, which cannot gain the moral sanction of the most sensitive moral spirit. So we have to do things in order to seek justice that shouldn't have moral sanction. He then says, it might injure our Christian conscience to put the law of love on the back burner, but it can't be helped. And then he says, and I think this is the last big quote from Niebuhr, we cannot refuse to make a decision between political answers to a problem simply because each answer is discovered to contain a moral ambiguity. And the money line is, we are responsible for making choices between greater and lesser evils. And then got to pause and say, lesser evils. What is he referencing? Go back to those terms. Lesser evils are things like self-assertion, resistance, coercion, or resentment. There are things in this world that I think we ought to resent, right? And these aren't lesser evils. They're appropriate responses to certain conditions in history. But Niebuhr calls them lesser evils. Because these things, in his mind, go against the law of love, of non-resistance to evil, they cannot be moral. And so in a nutshell, boiling down a lot of Niebuhrianism, Niebuhr does not believe that you can exercise moral responsibility in this world without incurring moral guilt. So remember Timothy Kudo, killing is always wrong, but in war it is necessary. He doesn't probably know it, but that is pure Niebuhrianism. Niebuhr articulates these tacit beliefs that are, I think, in both our religious and our secular culture, we're not morally comfortable or confident about judgments that lead to things like force and confrontation and lethal action. Even when we nevertheless pursue these hard actions, this belief about lesser evils has revealed itself to be deadly in light, as I've already suggested, in light of new understandings of moral trauma in combat. So I've already said that moral injury is doing something that goes against a deeply held moral belief. And I've already said that the number one predictor for moral injury is having killed in combat. It doesn't matter if it's an accidental death of a non-combatant, unarmed teenage boy, or if it's the killing of a lawful enemy under the terms of just war tradition and international law. Killing in combat, full stop, is the number one predictor for moral injury. Moral injury is the number one predictor for combat veteran suicide. So you can draw a line from killing in combat to combat veteran suicide. Obviously not everyone, right? But it is the number one predictor for combat veteran suicide. Killing is wrong, but in war it is necessary. If you believe that, you have made the very business of war fighting morally injurious. That's a crisis, right? And it's an unnecessary crisis because the Christian tradition has a much better way of thinking about all of this. And so now we come to restoration. All right, when those planes hit on September 11th, 2001, my PhD supervisor, Jean Bethke Elstein, of blessed memory, turned to a friend and said, now we remember what governments are for. all right? And what she meant is that government's most basic task is to help ensure those conditions that are necessary for justice and order and peace. And these are political goods without which no other political good can long last. Health, life, freedom, things like that. You need justice, you need order, you need peace. So a primary responsibility or primary reason for government's existence is remedial. It's to prevent from happening the worst things that human beings can do to one another. Sometimes some human beings cannot be talked out of doing the worst things they can do to other human beings. And if they can't be talked out of it, and if the worst things they're doing are sufficiently grave, they have to be knocked out of them. And we need terms for understanding when and how to do that. So the Christian intellectual tradition, drawing on both Hebraic and Greco-Roman thought, has yielded all sorts of rich resources, touching on all dimensions of human conflict, big and small. It's identified a range of tools that are conceptual, but also practicable, that are soft and hard to help political leaders think through these issues. And the just war tradition is the moral framework by which Christian intelligence has thought best about war for most of its history. It's been the predominant intellectual trend. And if you know anything about just war, it's broken into two major categories. I want to run through these because I think they're important to have in hand. There's the jus ad bellum, which is Latin for justice toward war, justice in going to war. When is it right to fight? That's the question it's asking. There are two major categories. One is deontological, or these are the things that have to be in place before war can be just. And then there's another whole cluster of things that are prudential. They're wisdom categories that help shape your thinking about war. The deontological or primary ones are these: proper authority, just cause, and right intention. And these three things map onto Augustine's chief political goods, which are order, justice, and peace. Order is proper authority. Justice is just cause. Peace is right intention. They map onto that. These are political goods. Now, right authority. Pretty basic. Ruler is that over whom there is no one greater, charged with the responsibility to secure and protect the order and the justice, and therefore the peace of the political community, but also externally to contribute to orderly, just, and peaceful relations with other political communities. That's the sovereign. Now, a political sovereign, an authority, can use two kinds of force. There's bellum, which you've already heard, the jus ad bellum. Bellum is war. It's force for public ends, for public goods. Force can also be used as duellum, from which we get the word duel. This is force for private ends or private goods. Bellum, as you can imagine, can be good or evil, depending on the circumstances, consequences, intentions, all of that. Duellum can always only be evil. You can never use violence for private good, right? That's wrong out of hand. And these two types of force also map with Augustine's descriptions of two kinds of love. There's caritas, charity. This is other-centered love of self-donation. And then there's cupiditas, from which we get the word cupidity. And this is self-directed love, right? This is self-direction and other donation. I donate you to benefit me, right? Charity is always good. Cupiditas is always wrong. It's always evil. Two different kinds of love that sort of mirror two different kinds of force. Or just cause. There are three just causes before a war can be morally appropriate. Protect the innocent, you requite an injustice, or you punish evil. Now, protect the innocent. This is fairly straightforward. You rescue the innocent from unjust harm. It's straightforward, but I want you to hear the qualifiers. Innocent, unjust harm. Because in Thomistic thought, in Augustinian thought, the phrase that doesn't come up for a just cause is self-defense. This is like the primary justification for war in international law, self-defense. Doesn't come up in the Christian tradition explicitly, right? You need the qualifiers, because if I attack you unjustly and you attack me back, I have no right to defend myself because I've done something unjust, right? So self-defense needs to be qualified, and it's qualified by saying the innocent and unjust aggression, all right? So that's the emphasis. The second idea is, or the second just cause, is to requite an injustice. Injustices need to be remedied. You ought to take back what has been wrongly taken. You ought to restore order, that sort of thing. Injustices ought to be requited. The third is like it. It's to punish evil, all right? And already, you see, protect the innocent, requite injustice, punish evil. You see the qualifiers all the way through, right? We've already got value terms attached to just causes. Punish evil comes in two different sort of motivations. The first motivation is to vindicate victims, right? If there's been an injustice, if something evil has happened, there are going to be victims. And to ignore what has happened is to suggest, at least tacitly, that what has happened to the victims is of no concern, doesn't matter. But when you requite an injustice, when you punish evil, you're proclaiming in part that the victim matters, that what has happened to them shouldn't go uncontested. And so you vindicate the value of the victims. You declare them innocent and worthy of justice. It's actually crucial. The second motivation is simply the restraint of the enemy and the incapacitation of their ability to continue in their injustice. All right? In this way, you should see the just war tradition as a way of promoting human flourishing. How it promotes the human flourishing of the innocent victim is obvious. You rescue them, you vindicate them, right? It promotes the flourishing of the right authority by helping them understand what their responsibilities are and to meet the terms of their own existence, to help them cultivate virtue, all right? And maybe counterintuitively, it also aids in the flourishing of our enemies. Because if we believe that at the end of the day, the person most harmed by evil is the evildoer themselves, and to try to rescue somebody from the doing of evil is an act of love, right? This idea of flourishing of the enemy also comes to bear on the last term, which is right intention. And the right intention for a just war is peace, right? You want to bring about reconciliation. Now, this doesn't always happen. Sometimes you hit Assad because he's gassed his people, and you know you're not going to have concord with him, but you want him to stop gassing his people, right? And so, but even there, you see how there's the restoration of a particular kind of order, even if it's very nuanced. It improves the situation, brings it closer toward what it ought to be. But in a large-scale conflict, the purpose of war is peace, to bring about a reconciliation with the enemy, which is another way of trying to promote the flourishing of your enemy. The aim of war is peace. The peace is desired in the first place for the innocent victims under unjust assault. If that's all we end up with, it was probably worth it. But ideally, in the second place, peace is with the enemy. I'm not going to talk about this, but this is another way of casting a just war as in some ways the first step in the process of forgiveness. If you want to ask about that later, feel free. All right. The second category of the just war is the jus in bello, and here Afghanistan starts to come even more into focus. There's three main categories. Jus in bello basically is justice in war. So how do you rightly fight that war that's right to fight? All right. There's three main categories. The first is military necessity. International law and their handling of just war really emphasizes military necessity. Christian discussion of just war, not so much. And I think that's a loss to the Christian tradition. So me and some others are belligerently trying to reinsert the idea of military necessity into the Christian conversation. There's a simple case for this. Force should only be used for significant reasons. If it's not militarily necessary to use the force, don't, right? You should use force only when it promotes the pursuit of victory. It's a stewardship issue. You use materials, you break things only when it's required. And while we might be permitted to spend the lives of our warriors, we should never waste them. And if the action in question isn't necessary, then to spend the lives of your men in that context is a waste. So you don't do it. So it also becomes, in this sense, a force protection issue. All right. In a second dimension, which I think is important, is that the idea of military necessity reinserts spurs and limits into the jus in bello criteria. If you look at the jus ad bellum, when is it right to fight? You've got this spur, which is the just cause. You see something's wrong, it needs to be remedied. That promotes the idea of going to war. But there's also limits, right? You have to be aimed at peace. And in all the prudential categories, which I've skipped over, things like probability of success, last resort, these are restraints. So it's right to fight, but there might be prudent reasons not to, right? Or not to yet. Prior to military necessity being reinserted into the in bello criteria, we only had restraints. And the two restraints are proportionality and discrimination. Military necessity puts it back in. If it's militarily necessary, do it, unless it's particularly indiscriminate or particularly disproportionate. So very briefly, discrimination is you have to separate combatants from non-combatants. And generally, you can only target combatants, those who mean you harm. In warfare, the idea of who means you harm can get very complicated very quickly, but you only target those who mean you harm, all right? Proportionality has to do with a weighing of harms and goods. And this comes in two ways. If you're thinking about a particular action and a question of proportionality, you ask yourself, if I do this thing, are the goods that are likely to come from the successful doing of this thing, do those goods outweigh the harms that will likely come from the successful doing of this thing? That's the first type. But you also have to ask the reverse. If I don't do this thing, particularly when it's the militarily necessary thing, will the goods that come from not doing the thing outweigh the harms that will come from not doing the thing? All right, which I think, just to chum the waters, makes the case for the bombing of Hiroshima. But we'll skip over that for now. All right, so that is roughly an overview of the just war tradition. I want you to take away many things, but two predominantly. One, it's not new moral legislation. This is simply how we think about moral conflicts when goods come into conflict, all right? So you think of a surgeon contemplating the removal of a child's leg, all right? He's not gonna do it unless there's a just cause. Maybe the leg is gangrene, unless they have the proper authority, they have the experience and all of that to be able to render that kind of judgment. They have the right intention. You know, they want to save the child's life, bodily wholeness, all of that, right? Last resort, you know, have you tried other things? Probability of success, proportionality, you're going to make it worse or do you have a chance of making it better? The just war framework isn't simply the way we think about war. It's the way we think about any kind of moral conflict in which the goods seem in contradiction. All right. And because of all of that, the just war tradition, I want to argue, does not require a recalibration of morality. Pace Timothy Kudo. We know that killing comes in different kinds. Some of it is always wrong. We call it murder. Don't do it. That's the end of that conversation. Some of it is accidental, right? The killing of these two unarmed Afghan teenagers was an accident. Now, maybe there could be varying degrees of moral culpability. You should have been more careful. You should have done something else to try to prevent it. But essentially, it's morally neutral. But there's another kind of killing, if the just war tradition is correct, that is morally permitted. And if it's really correct, there are types of killing that in certain circumstances, tragically, are morally obligatory. All right, we can talk about that as well. So the only right answer to the question, is killing wrong, is something like, I don't know, which killing are you talking about? What are the circumstances? What's the intention? What would be the consequences of doing it or not doing it? All right, in summary of all of that, however much we may morally sanction a particular kill or killing in general in a just war, we mustn't be glib about it. We mustn't be too easy about it. But here's a long quote from Augustine. It is the wrongdoing of the opposing party which compels the wise man to wage just wars. And this wrongdoing, even though it gave rise to no war, would still be a matter of grief to man because it is a man's wrongdoing. So therefore, let everyone who thinks with pain on all these great evils, which are so horrible, so ruthless, acknowledge that this is a misery and if any other endures or thinks on these things without mental pain, well, this is more miserable still, for he thinks himself happy because he has lost human feeling. So in agreement with Kudo, Augustine and just war tradition understands that sorrow about killing can be appropriate. But in disagreement with Niebuhr, Augustine knows that grief is not the same thing as guilt. You have not necessarily done something that violates a deeply held moral belief. And therefore, war should not be, by its very business, morally injurious. It should always probably be morally bruising, right? There's an impact trauma, but it's something like a surface wound. It doesn't run or needn't run very deep. All right, so that's a summary of all of that. How does all of that play into Afghanistan? And here, I want to take about 10 minutes and just say a few general things to set us up for a conversation. All right, after 20 years of war of varying scales, the US war in Afghanistan is done. The problem is that the mission is not over. What do I mean by that? The fact, before I get into what I mean by that, I want to stress that the fact that the mission is not over is something of a calamity, because we have just lost a major military stronghold in the jihadist heartland, and that's going to be a problem. 20 years in Afghanistan has kept the jihadists on the run. It has kept the lid on that problem. There has not been another major foreign terrorist attack on US soil since that war. Their focus being the terrorists' focus, the jihadists' focus, was essentially on not getting killed by our RPAs, or remote piloted aircraft, and our special forces, right? That was their point of focus. Now they can stop running, they can catch their breath, they can reconstitute. The suicide bombing at the Kabul airport, I think, confirms this. Afghanistan will again become a place that jihadist groups can recruit, train, fundraise, plan, and attack from. Some dismiss this as irrelevant. They say, well, we're much better equipped to thwart terrorism now than we were in 2001. So it doesn't really matter. If they want to bring an attack, let them try. This sort of, and this is probably roughly true, but at the same time, it seems important to remember that our enemies seem to think that getting back into Afghanistan was worth their ongoing efforts to fight their way back in. There were other places they could go. They wanted to get back in there. Why? In part, Afghanistan and Western Pakistan, taken together, is the location of the densest network of overlapping jihadist groups anywhere in the world. This is their heartland. When they hold land, they can get together, they can dream together, they can train together, they can inspire one another, they can fight together, and they can go abroad together. And when they go abroad, nothing good usually comes of that, right? So the mission is not over. The mission was to destroy Al-Qaeda. We destroyed bin Laden, but Al-Qaeda is still going. All right, the Afghan military and government dropped like bags of rocks. This was inevitable. So it was a failure from the start. Was it? Why did the Afghan military and government drop like a bag of rocks? Here I'm going to summarize in gross simplicity a great number of complicated things, but I'll say this. The Afghan military and the government dropped like a bag of rocks because we withdrew all our US forces, including the air support that we were giving to the Afghan military. That's it. Now, we had achieved something like a sustainable position in 2014. We had a rough stability. Over the last 7 years, since 2014, 66, according to one source, 66 Americans were killed in combat in the last 7 years, killed in combat. And I don't honestly know if that includes the last 13. I don't think it does. Now, this is important. Why is this important? Because much has been made of the low level of attacks since President Trump made agreements with the Taliban to pull out last summer. Prior to the Kabul suicide bombing, no US deaths had occurred all year. So that's true. There was a remarkable decrease in US deaths and US attacks against the US. So therefore, many warned that these attacks would simply start up again and US casualties mount if Biden reversed course. But the trend had been low since 2014. So that's not entirely true. Certainly it would have gone up, but they were low since 2014, which suggests that there was something sustainable going on. There was some momentum toward this already. In 2014, we had 30,000 troops in Afghanistan. Then we began the drawdown. And as we handed over primary control of various territories of the Afghan army, conflict increased, the civil war increased. But the government never lost total control of any district. So yes, an ongoing civil war, but the war wasn't lost. They continued to have our air support, our advisors, and our trainers. They continued fighting. So the Biden administration now says that all of this was inevitable. They say that the chaos surrounding the withdrawal proves this. But there's another way to cash this all out. You could say that what they did is a self-fulfilled prophecy. They looked into a future, or they pretended they could look into the future. And they made current strategy based on what they say was the foreseen future. They made decisions that brought that future into being. The Afghan army collapsed when we took away US air support. Biden's announcement, Trump's announcement prior to that of a full withdrawal, when everybody said that the Afghan army is not ready to sustain itself, had to have been a crippling blow to the morale of the Afghan fighter. I mean, they broke and ran because they don't want to fight a lost cause. And who could blame them? And then our president has the gall to suggest that they wouldn't fight. They had fought and bled and died beside us for the last 12 or so years after the US had taken control of their training. They had fought and died and bled in gross numbers. Tens of thousands of Afghan fighters died. Don't tell me they wouldn't fight. But that is an absolute travesty of what they had already done. It's said that we couldn't fight forever. Well, that's true. But we also can't fight on timetables, which is what was being expected of us. People criticized the war as hopelessly open-ended. Fine, but here's the thing. Wars tend to be open-ended. At some point in World War II, we didn't know how that conflict was going to end, but we didn't fight it on a timetable. We said, until 1945, no longer, right? You fight wars that are open-ended because you need victory. So wars by nature are open-ended. Now, it's also true that victory in certain types of wars against Nazi Germany, against militant Japan, victory against such regimes could be described in easier ways than what was going on in Afghanistan. This is true, and it's a good argument. But I think we could describe what victory in Afghanistan would look like. We could cobble together something that would seem like a victory, a successful conclusion. It was probably never going to be a centralized government over the whole country. Afghanistan is a notoriously fragmented nation, but that's not to say that it's never been a nation at all. There's been a state in Afghanistan since 1747. There's a long history there. There's stuff to build on. Unimaginably hard to govern. Undoubtedly, centralized government trying to exert authority over all the country was probably never going to work. Right? 1964, I think I can remember the date, they had a constitution, they had a monarch, and it was kind of going okay. But one of the things that monarch didn't try to do was to exercise authority over all the countries. So there was a kind of power sharing and all of that. Could that have been duplicated? And here we could get into conversations about nation building and the foolhardiness of that or the wisdom of that. The one thing I want to suggest is that those who suggest that what we were trying to do was to reshape Afghanistan in our own image, I'm not sure how true that is. So first of all, nation building is a very complex thing, sinking lots of money into infrastructure and roads and all kinds of things. We actually did that for a very limited time in Afghanistan. Most of the time, we just did counterterrorism. Those are different things. It wasn't 20 years of nation building. But this idea that we're trying to reshape the Afghans under our own image, I think pushes against at least one thing. And that's this idea that if we are all made in the image of God, and I think we are all made in the image of God, the Afghans included, then human beings were made morally free, right? We're moral agents. Human beings were made to be free. And so I think there is something to be said about the impulse in every human heart for autonomy. And that's not to say for democracy and things like that. So we very quickly get this wrong. But I think freedom is in every human heart. I imagine that over generations of a particular kind of regime, you could be habituated out of that desire. I know this in part because I lived for 12 years in Slovakia. So Slovakia, I hope you know, used to be under communist rule. I got there in 1994. This was about 3.5 years after the communists left. I stayed there for 12 years. So when I left, they were about 16 years outside of communist rule. They were just getting started being a vibrant democratic regime capable of self-rule. They were just getting started, right? That was 16 years, and they had a whole lot of advantages that the Afghans haven't had. It still took them a very long time. I'm going to speed forward and bring this to a stop. I had a Marine friend send me a Twitter feed that was heartbreaking. There was somebody, I don't know, in Afghanistan where they were, but they were asking their Afghan friends, what were you doing before and what are you doing now? And there was just this long list of female Afghans writing about the things they were doing prior to the Taliban taking over the whole country again and what they're doing now. And it's heartbreaking, right? And I'm not saying, as callous as this sounds, that creating the conditions so that a girl can learn the alphabet is worth going to war. I think it probably is. But we were there. We were invited there by them knocking over our buildings, not turning over the people who did it. And so like walking outside and finding the broken bird, and all of a sudden you feel a moral burden because you see this broken bird, like we were involved. And because we were involved, I think we had a responsibility to stay and to try to maintain the goods that were achieved. They were pretty staggering. Girls going to school, women being able to go outside uncovered. Not everywhere. In some of the tribal lands, they still stayed covered. They still didn't go to school. They still didn't go to work, right? So again, it was always going to be complex. But by every metric, the economy was improving. Human rights were on the increase. Was it perfect? Not by a song, right? But it was getting better. Was the government corrupt? As all get out, right? The Slovak government was corrupt for 16 years, right? It takes time to get these things out. But as I've said, I think the worst calamity is what it does, not even to US reputation, right? People will say, oh, we've scuttled our credibility. The Chinese know we'll never defend Taiwan. Maybe so. I think there's a real hit that might be seen there. But I think most of the world knows that if we really want to, we'll fight for what we value. So our credibility probably didn't take a significant hit, but it took something of it. I think we've lost ground in the great power conflict, which is, I think, is going to be the primary problem in the future. I mean, look at the map, right? For China to come into Afghanistan, they have better access to the Persian Gulf than they had prior to that. We've lost Bagram Air Force Base, which was in Afghanistan. It would have been really nice to have that, and the Chinese really wouldn't have liked it, right? That would have helped. So for people to say, oh, Afghanistan was a distraction from great power conflict, I think it was a part of it. So I dismissed that. But I think the worst thing is this idea that we have abandoned friends and allies, right? The interpreters, the government workers, all sorts of people who have helped us try to reconstitute Afghanistan over the last 20 years. And because we have special obligations to our own before we have them to other people, the worst travesty is the betrayal of our own war fighters. Because again, as I started with, for 20 years, we told them the fight was worth it. And then when we got out of there and everything is just as it was, except now they're better armed because they've got our stuff, I think war fighters have every reason to question whether or not what we did was worth it. That's a tragedy. All right. That's it.
Questions? Got some red meat here.
There should be a little bit of red meat thrown on the table. Please.
Okay, so you mentioned earlier dominion.
Mm-hmm.
But then you mentioned one of the reasons for just war is to punish people.
Mm-hmm.
So we are given dominion over the earth, but we're trusting God to punish people in his own right. So is that just as a Christian to go to war to punish people? We know that
See, I partially like where you're going with it, but then I challenge a bit of it. If I had more time, I would talk about church and future hope. I would talk about responsibility. We have responsibility in history for the conditions of history. I think that's a part of dominion, creation care. We care about creation. That's a partial responsibility, not an ultimate one. History finally, thank God, is not up to us. That's different than saying we have no role to play whatsoever. When the innocent are being sufficiently assaulted, when there is a sufficiently grave injustice, when there's a sufficiently grave evil that has to be restrained and stopped, human beings have a responsibility under the creation mandate to do something about it. It's partial. We don't have ultimate responsibility, but we do the good that we can. We help where we're able, and we try to do no harm. You know, just like I have a responsibility for my children's welfare. I am not, and I am learning this to my increasing heartbreak, I have no ultimate control over the welfare of my children. But I have an awful lot of immediate control. And there's certain things that I can do. And so as I go through the world as a father, I try to figure out what are those things that I can do something about. And then I do something about them. And at some point, because circumstances are beyond my control, or because they have to be allowed to make their own decisions because they're free moral beings, I have to release control. And at that moment, I have to rely on God. But I think we've been given responsibilities and we have to meet them. Just like I have to feed my children. If I see somebody under assault, I have a basic responsibility to try to protect them. It's not ultimate. And the 20th century, if no other century, the 20th century teaches us the horrors that happen when people try to bring about a utopian end or utopian goal. So we mustn't do that. History is offers a butcher's board of examples of the hells on earth that we create when we try to take the place of God and have some sort of, ultimate responsibility. That's not ours, but we have a partial responsibility. Does that help?
I have a question in the second part, if that's okay.
I don't see anybody else asking one, so feel free.
So you talk about rescue as being another reason for what merits rescue? You did mention that he did try to adapt Afghanistan to what we believe is a particular culture that's acceptable. So how do we, in some regards, how do we define rescue? What is the reason for that without ruining their self-determination of their work?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I didn't mean to suggest that we created it in our image. I was trying to push against that narrative. But for instance, the Constitution that they wrote is basically a cut and paste from, and again, I don't remember the date, but I think 1964, that might be wrong. But it's a cut and paste from the Constitution they had prior. We let them do that. That Constitution was largely, not uniformly, but largely accepted by the Afghan people. And poll after poll after poll, the Afghan people are saying, we like this, we like that, we like that, we need more of this, more of that. They're backing the changes that are happening, not uniformly. But, you do a survey of almost any topic in America, you're not going to have uniformity. But there was a general consensus that the Afghan people were behind the reconstitution of an Afghan government under the constitution that they had previously had. I think the one mistake we made was we probably did try to fashion their army in the image of the American army, and that was a problem. But that could have probably been rectified, just with time, with keeping a small presence. When I say we should have stayed, I also don't think that the force we had in place when we left could have been the force that we kept. It would have had to have been ratcheted up. And I don't know what the magic number is. Certainly more than the, 2,500 we had. But I think we did a reasonably good job of being a stabilizing force and trying to let the Afghans create their own government. There's all sorts of things we did that were stupid and just stupid and cowardly, probably. But I think we did a pretty good job of doing the best we could. ish, which is, I think, partly why we love the idea that the fall of Afghanistan was inevitable, because it lets us off the hook. It lets us stop believing we're stupid and cowardly.
When you were talking about just reasons for the war, you mentioned two causes that I understood, the two reasons: just cause and right intentions. Mm-hmm. You also mentioned proper authority.
Yep.
And could you expand on that, especially when it comes to revolutions like the American Revolution?
Yeah, right.
What constitutes proper authority?
Yeah, that's great. It's a good question. So, you know, in the easy sense, when you've got a functioning government, the proper authority is the person most responsible, over whom there is no one greater, charged with the care of the political community. So in our regime, that's easy. It's the president, you know, in collaboration with Congress. That's simple. Now, with the society where the government seems to be breaking down, it becomes really complex. So we had a sovereign authority in America pre-revolution, but a group of Americans decided, well, it's no longer functioning. Right? So Thomas Aquinas has this long dissertation or disquisition on revolution and when is that appropriate. And so the ideal for Thomas Aquinas was always a monarch, but beneath the monarch, if the monarch begin to sort of unking themselves, but they begin to fail to meet the responsibilities of being a sovereign, then there could be ideally a small group of responsible sort of representatives, you know, petty monarchs, that can get together and join forces and say, the king is unkinged himself, we need to step in and revolt. So there is a tradition of just revolution. It's plotting, it's careful because it recognizes that what it's suggesting is potentially disastrous, but it's there. Now, if you ask a friend of ours, Nigel Bigger, he will say the American Revolution was unjust. And every now and then on the 4th of July, we have a public debate about it. So for some, it's not a foregone conclusion that it was just. But there was a group of Americans who represented some of the leadership of the local communities, and they decided the king had unkinged himself. Is that helpful? Okay. Please.
What point would it be too costly?
Yeah, I don't know, but there is a point, surely, right? And you really don't want to get into the sunk cost fallacy, right? Where, well, we've already spent $1 trillion, what's $1 trillion more? Oh, we've already spent $2 trillion, what's $1 trillion more? So, you know, without being able to predict, you know, we're only going to spend this much and no more, which is a kind of timetable, it's a financial one. You know, surely there is a point where it's too much, and I'm not, you know, but if the cause is worth it, then presumably no cost is too much, and then we can get into all sorts of questions about, you know, what price really did that expenditure have on a sovereign's responsibilities to his own people or her own people, which I think would be one of the side constraints. So I would say, well, you know, you spend whatever you need to spend in order to achieve victory. And then I would throw in this side constraint of saying, so long as you're not grossly violating other responsibilities you already have, right? So then the calculus becomes complex, and I think it's case dependent. I don't know what the number would be in Afghanistan, but I'm not entirely sure that we were jeopardizing sovereign responsibilities in America. I'm not sure that our spending on Afghanistan prohibited us from spending things here. You know, AOC would have a huge consternation over that, but I think that's the case. Go ahead.
As a response, like veterans associations in America, a lot of them are struggling. When, for example, their affiliates given to the Afghan government, that they get lost somewhere. There was an argument where the government is betting on something that isn't very good, even though they have something that is anomalous for your.
Yeah, I just don't think that misspending and one area. So the Veterans Affairs, for instance, is simply due to expenditures in Afghanistan. I think that's a larger issue than, gosh, if we didn't spend the money in Afghanistan, everything here would be going swimmingly. I think it would have still been an issue, right? I mean, nobody's ever been satisfied with the way the government spends its money. I don't think the expenditures in Afghanistan significantly change that conversation. I think it's always going to be the nature of the regime. It's a problem that, you know, a lot of money sent to the Afghan government got misdirected, but lots of US foreign aid all over the planet gets misdirected all the time. But we have a sense that we ought to spend money on foreign aid. So it's just always, it's the right question to ask. How much, at what cost to ourselves? But every dollar that's spent overseas doesn't necessarily mean there's no values that come to the US to Americans, right? I think stability overseas pays dividends for America. A stable international order is something like an outer perimeter of security for our country. You know, when there's calamities somewhere in the world, especially in a geographically significant place, America is going to get involved. So we benefit domestically from international security. So there's always just going to be this calculus of cost benefit. I don't have a better answer than that.
And then bringing in laws to just work criteria. My question is, you know, for particular schools, and you know, I think I mentioned something earlier in my class, but you know, if in terms of you said, we would say that the war is unjust, but for the particular soldier fighting, he or she fulfills the use of development. Would that be warrant for educating the parents? The guilt that the soldier might kind of
So the
soldier is not responsible for the transgressing use of development.
Sure.
That could be for use of development. And so I guess my question is, if the soldier is only responsible for use of development is an unjust war, could that soldier still be vindicated guilt?
Right.
Kind of on your model?
Yeah, nice. Yes. You know, barring case-specific circumstances, right? So if you know that your regime is truly diabolical, but I would have a pretty hard time figuring out how it could ever be just to be fighting for that regime, right? That's pretty hard. Now, there is something to be said for the fact that, like, I'm not fighting the Americans, I'm not fighting the Russians, I am protecting my German grandmother, because I know that the Americans are bombing her village. And so, you know, I want her to live. And I think there we just have to be agnostic and step back and say, well, what do we do? If the war ends, we don't prosecute that person, that's for sure, right? You know, and there's a particularly good book by, I want to say his name is Adam Marcos, I might not be right. And I can't remember what the name of the book is, but it's about a German fighter pilot who spares a crippled US bomber that's trying to escape German airspace. And he actually escorts it out of German airspace and helps it get home. And at some point fairly early in the war, he realized he was fighting in an unjust war. But he wanted to protect the German homeland from being bombed. And so he was trying to reconcile that in his own Christian soul. And that's where we talked earlier about a concept called the moral equality of soldiers, where they say soldiers are only responsible for the way they behave in a war, that most times they cannot be responsible for the decisions their government makes. And this is why we don't prosecute an entire army when we've defeated an army, when we think that army was fighting unjustly. if you fought nobly, if you kept the terms of a just war, then yeah, I think that's a kind of personal vindication. There may be a point where that turns and you say, I can't support this military in any way. And maybe the best thing I can do for my homeland is to help us lose, right? So there's a complex case of, I'm gonna completely forget this man's name. But he was somebody who early on collaborated with Bonhoeffer and his group, and they were talking about the assassination of Hitler. I can't believe I can't remember this man's name, but they even actually met in his home. But he decided at the end that he couldn't support the assassination attempt, not because he didn't think Hitler should die, but because he wanted the German people not to feel vindicated by having assassinated Hitler. He said, I don't think that'll be enough for us to come to terms with our moral guilt. And so he actually wanted Germany to get broken by the war because that was the only way that they would truly know the evils that they had supported. And so that for him, you know, the crushing defeat of Germany was the best that he thought he could do as a patriot. So I think it's going to be case dependent, difficult.
We're going to give Dr. Hardin the last question.
Real quick, so I think that providing a justification for starting a political world order with treasure and blood.
Right.
And that's great, except that the people that have been given that justification in our country to our sovereign, the people, for the last 8 years, have basically been pushed aside and not been listened to. It's pretty clear that the sovereign American people aren't actually that interested, at least in terms of Afghanistan, and pursuing that. So, in that sense, our agents, the principals, the agents Trump has provided, kind of follow through the order. That could have been done at a better, sir. But my question is, so yeah, even if we agree, like we're on the losing side in a political debate, where we don't have any major actors that are advocating for this sort of position. So what would you say though now, because we can't go back to the past, the world that we inherited, right? But it sounds like we believe we still have some moral obligations to our own soldiers, but also perhaps to Afghanistan. Given a political context where Americans don't seem particularly interested in those moral obligations, what would you say? What do we owe Afghanistan, and what can we do that might at least have some sensitivity to those obligations? You and our
yeah, I mean, honestly, I almost have no idea, right? You know, the what's that? Like, I mean, now given the circumstances, like, what can we do? It's not as if, you know, when I say we should have stayed, not indefinitely, we should have stayed long enough for the Afghan army to, you know, make gains, to be able to stand up on its own, for the Afghan government to be a little bit less corrupt and better able to do, you know, at least to function basically like a government. But here's the thing. So I question that. Like you said, the American people aren't interested. I think that's exactly right. I think we just don't care, one way or the other. Like, I'm not sure. I mean, it was always a campaign issue, but I don't know that the average American had any clue what we were doing in Afghanistan. We just had some vague sense that we were there, and we never liked flag draped coffins, and we should leave. So that's a real thing, and I wrestle with that. Like, to what degree does a U.S. president listen to their people? I also think it's a tragedy that over 20 years, I don't think the American people were ever given the case for Afghanistan beyond we got to kill bin Laden. And I think there was a case that could be made, but for 4 administrations, that case was never made. And I think it could have been and should have been. And I think a sovereign owes their people an explanation. This is why I think declaration of war is so important. I think it's an opportunity for the sovereign to say, here's the case. Here's what we're going to do, among many other different things. You know, I think there's a point where the sovereign says, you know, I get what you want, but I know what's, you know, or at least I think I know what's better for us. And here's what we're going to do. Oh, I know, I get it. I think that's why a 20-year campaign is always going to be difficult for America, because we're tied to an election cycle. This would have been so much different if we were a monarchy, right? because you could just do your thing. Oh, I know, I understand. I have a very dissatisfying answer to that myself, but.
Well, thank you very much for bringing us this talk.
For sure.
Appreciate it. We still have dinner starting at 6 o'clock at Windsor, and a number of you already responded. We've got about 5 more spots if any of you would like to come talk to me and information for that. That'll be about 6 o'clock. But appreciate you coming, and we'll continue the conversation this evening.
Everybody. Well, I'm going to end this.
Oh, yes, please.